The night Corvin showed up at her door, Senna had been sitting on her bathroom floor for 40 minutes, holding a dish towel against her forearm and trying to remember if she owned a sewing kit. She didn't. She found a stapler under the kitchen sink instead, and she was still staring at it, genuinely considering it, when the knock came. Not loud, not urgent. The kind of knock that didn't need to be either, because the person making it had never once been ignored in his life. Senna set the stapler down. She pressed the towel harder against her arm. She did not move. The knock came again. His voice through the door, low and even, the way it always was. The way that made you feel like the world had slowed down to accommodate him. Open the door. She hadn't told him her address. She had been very careful about that. Senna pulled herself up using the edge of the tub. The linoleum was cold through her socks. She caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror for half a second, the towel, the pallor, the shadows under her eyes that had stopped being shadows and started being permanent, and she looked away before her brain could fully process what it was seeing. She shuffled to the door. She didn't take the chain off. "Mr. Corvin." She kept her voice flat, professional. 2 years of practice. "This isn't a good time." A pause. She heard him breathe once through the door. "When is it ever?" he said, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been angry about it. "I'm not," she stopped, started again. "I had an accident. I'm fine. I'll be in tomorrow." "You weren't in today?" I called. "You texted. There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. Senna. He almost never used her first name. In 2 years she could count the times on one hand. It always landed wrong, like a door opening in a wall you'd thought was solid. She took the chain off. The first thing he did when she opened the door was look at her arm. She'd wrapped the towel around it more tightly before she opened up, and she'd pulled her sleeve down over the top of it, and it still didn't matter. His eyes went straight to it. He had that kind of attention, the kind that cost something to be on the receiving end of. "What happened?" he said, not a question. "I told you accident." "With what?" "A box cutter." She stepped back from the door, because there was nothing else to do. He was already looking past her into the apartment. She watched him take it in, the water-stained ceiling tiles, the second-hand furniture, the single overhead bulb that buzzed faintly when the refrigerator cycled on, the stack of her employer's quarterly reports sitting on her kitchen table, because she'd taken them home to work on them, because she'd had nothing else to do with her evening. His face didn't change. It almost never did. But there was something around his eyes that shifted slightly, and she hated it. "Sit down," he said. "I'm standing fine, you're grey." He walked past her toward the kitchen. "Sit down." Senna sat down at the kitchen table. It was easier than arguing, and she was very tired. She heard him opening cabinets, the sound of running water. She looked at the reports in front of her. Q3 projections for the Corvin Group's legitimate holdings, the ones she was technically employed to manage, and thought, distantly, that she should probably turn them face down. He shouldn't see his own numbers annotated in her handwriting at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday when she was supposed to be on sick leave. He came back with a glass of water, a clean cloth from somewhere she hadn't known she owned, and the first aid kit that had been sitting unopened under her bathroom sink since the day she'd moved in 14 months ago. He sat down across from her. He set everything on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who was used to making decisions quickly and precisely, and then he looked at her arm. "Let me see it. I can handle it." "I know you can," he held out his hand. "Let me see it anyway." She didn't know why she did it. Later she'd tell herself it was blood loss, that there hadn't been enough left in her to fuel proper stubbornness, but that wasn't entirely honest. She put her arm on the table and let him unwrap the towel. He didn't react. She'd expected him to react. He looked at the cut the way he looked at spreadsheets, the way he looked at everything, like it was information to be processed and acted on, nothing more. "It needs stitches," he said. "I know. You were going to staple it." She looked up. He nodded toward the kitchen counter, where she'd set the stapler down before going to answer the door. She felt her face do something complicated. "It was a contingency," she said. "Senna, I've handled worse." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way people usually looked at her, not with pity, Not with the calculating assessment she got from his associates, not with the particular dismissal she'd grown up under. Just looking. Taking inventory. "I believe you," he said quietly, and that was somehow the worst thing he'd said yet. He drove her to a private clinic off Bloor Street that she hadn't known existed, which made sense, because it was the kind of place that didn't advertise. A doctor she'd never seen before stitched her arm in a room that looked more like a study than an examination room, and didn't ask her any questions she'd have had to lie about. Corvin sat in the corner the entire time, with his coat still on, his elbows on his knees, watching the procedure with the same neutral attention he gave everything else. On the drive back, she stared out the window at the wet November streets and counted the things she didn't know about this man she'd worked for since she was 26 years old. She knew his schedule, she knew his numbers, every account, every holding, every layered company name in every filing. She knew he took his coffee black, and that he didn't sleep well, and that he'd once dismissed a man from a meeting for arriving 3 minutes late, and never mentioned it again. She knew he had 3 phones and used 2 of them, and that the third sat in his desk drawer, and never rang except on the 14th of every month, when he'd answer it in his office alone with the door closed. She did not know where he lived. She did not know if the woman whose name appeared in last year's social column, one Lynette Haverstock, photographed at a harbourfront gala on his arm, was still in the picture, or had ever really been. She did not know why he was here. She did not know why he'd driven her himself, when he had 4 different people on staff who handled exactly this kind of errand. "You can drop me at the corner," she said. "I'll take you to the door. The corner's fine." He didn't answer. He drove her to the door. She got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and he rolled the window down and looked at her. "There's a car outside your building tomorrow morning," he said. 7:30. "That's not necessary." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He drove away. She stood on the sidewalk until she couldn't see the tail lights anymore. And then she went upstairs and sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning a single page of the reports. She'd come to the Corvin Group the way people came to most things she'd done in her life, out of necessity and with no better option in reach. The placement agency had sent her in with a folder of certifications and a haircut she'd borrowed money for, and the very specific kind of confidence that is actually a form of controlled desperation. The woman at the front desk had looked at her the way people looked at her in most rooms. That quick calculation, the flicker of surprise at her credentials, the recovery into professional neutrality that wasn't quite neutral. Senna had been doing that math her whole life. She'd stopped minding it, mostly. The interview had been with a man named Fowler, one of Corvin's senior operations directors. He'd asked her 3 questions, and then turned her file face down and told her the position had already been filled. She'd asked to speak to Corvin directly. Fowler had looked at her for a very long moment. She'd said, "Tell him I found the error in his Q2 reconciliation. The one in the Gibraltar filing." She'd read it in the public submission, a small thing nested 3 levels deep. "Tell him that. He'll want to hear the rest." Fowler had left the room and come back in 4 minutes. Corvin had hired her that afternoon. He'd never asked her how she'd spotted it. She'd never told him. It was the first and only thing they'd left uncounted between them, and she thought that had been, on his part, intentional. He was a man who understood the value of leaving certain ledgers open. He showed up at the office the next morning 20 minutes before she did. She knew because she came in at 7:15, which was 20 minutes earlier than she was expected, which meant he'd been there since before 7. The light under his office door, the quiet that had a different quality to it than an empty building. She hung up her coat. She made 2 coffees. She brought one to his door and knocked. "Come in." She opened the door. He was at his desk with 3 files open and his jacket off, the way he only ever was in the early hours when he didn't know anyone else was in the building. He looked up. He looked at her arm the way he had last night. She set the coffee down in front of him. "The Ferris account," she said. "There's a discrepancy in the October transfer. About 60,000. I thought you should know before the Moreau meeting this afternoon." He looked at her, then at the coffee, then back at her. 60,000, he repeated. 62, technically. I can have the corrected summary ready before lunch. He picked up the coffee. He said nothing for a moment. Senna. Sir, sit down. She sat in the chair across his desk, the one for clients, the one she'd sat in exactly once, the day he hired her. She'd stood for every meeting since. How long have you been in that apartment? He said. She hadn't expected that. She recalibrated quickly, the way you learned to. 14 months. Before that, a sublet in Parkdale. She paused. Before that, a room above a laundromat on Dundas. He looked at her steadily. You've been here 2 years. Yes, your salary is fair, she said. More than fair. I'm not complaining about my salary. That's not what I'm asking. She held his gaze. It cost her something, but she held it. I have some debts, she said. Old ones. They're being handled. He didn't push it. He never pushed things twice. He had a way of pulling information toward him without pressure, just by the particular quality of his attention. Most people eventually told him everything he wanted to know, just to fill the silence. She'd noticed that about him in the first week and worked very hard to become the exception. The corrected summary, he said finally. Before the Moreau meeting, before noon, she confirmed. She got up to leave. She was at the door when he said, the car will be there tonight as well, and tomorrow. She turned. Mr. Corvin, consider it a precaution. The stitches need a week. I take the subway. I know. He looked down at his files. Consider it a precaution, she thought about arguing. She thought about the look on his face last night when he'd unwrapped the towel from her arm. That careful neutrality that had cost him something too, she realized now. Or maybe she'd imagined it. All right, she said. She went back to her desk and started on the corrected summary. She found out about Lynette Haverstock the way she found out most things, by accident and then by inference. An envelope on his desk slid under a stack of papers, handwriting she didn't recognize, addressed to the office instead of his private address, which was unusual. She set it aside without opening it, the way she did with personal correspondence. 3 days later, it was gone. 2 weeks after that, she arrived at the office to find a florist's arrangement in the lobby that no one had authorized and no one had signed for, and she spent 20 minutes tracking down the order before she found the name attached. Lynette Haverstock, Corvin's fiancée. The word sat in her chest in a way she didn't examine closely. She put the flowers in the conference room and rerouted the bill to the personal accounts line and said nothing to anyone. That evening, she stayed late working on a variance report that didn't strictly need to be finished that night. The office emptied around her. Corvin stayed too. She could hear him through the wall, the low murmur of phone calls, the occasional silence that meant he was thinking. It happened sometimes, both of them working late in parallel, on either side of his office wall, and she'd found it easier than she'd expected, being that close to someone without being required to be anything. She was nearly done with the report when she heard him hang up and go quiet for a long moment. Then, Senna. Through the door. Yes, go home. She looked at the screen. 4 more rows. 5 minutes. The silence stretched. The car's been waiting since 7. She hadn't known that. She hadn't known he knew she was still there, either, or that he'd had the car wait. She finished the report and logged off and put her coat on and went to the door of his office. I'll finish the variance report tomorrow, she said. He was standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city lights. He turned when she spoke. For a moment they looked at each other across the length of the office, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was the loneliest person she had ever met, and that it suited him, and that he'd worked very hard to make it that way. Good night, he said. Good night, Mr. Corvin. She went home. She sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that whatever she was feeling was irrelevant, inadvisable, and categorically not her problem. She'd believed all 3 of those things at the time. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, addressed to her at the office, no return address, her full name spelled correctly, Senna Darke. No one outside the Corvin Group had this address. She opened it at her desk with a letter opener, which was the last calm thing she did for the next several hours. Inside, a photograph. Her. coming out of the Bloor Street clinic, the private one, the one that didn't advertise. Date stamp from 3 weeks ago. On the back, in block letters, "We know what he does for you. Tell Yus, he does it too, or we tell everyone what you are." She put the photograph face down on her desk. She pressed her palms flat on either side of it. She thought about what everyone meant in this context. She thought about the debts she'd told him were being handled, the ones that weren't, really, not fully, not yet. She thought about the room above the laundromat and the sublet in Parkdale and the 6 years before those that she didn't think about if she could help it. She thought about how easy it would be, actually. What they were asking wasn't even much. She'd seen names. She'd seen numbers. She'd seen enough to put certain people in front of certain other people who would pay well to know it. She thought about what that money would feel like. She thought about being free. She picked up her phone. She almost called a number she hadn't dialed in 4 years. She put her phone down. She put the photograph in her bag. She went back to her work. She told herself she was still deciding. She wasn't still deciding. She'd already decided. She just needed a moment to grieve it. She didn't tell him that day, or the next. She told herself she needed time to think about how. The truth was something smaller and harder to look at. She didn't want to see his face when she showed him the photograph. Not because she was afraid of what he'd do. She had a fairly accurate map of what he was capable of, in the abstract, and she'd made peace with it. She was afraid of something else. The particular expression he'd have when he understood what it meant. That someone had thought she could be used. That they'd looked at her and seen a lever. She'd spent her whole life being a lever. She was tired of it. On the 4th day, she came in to find him standing at her desk. He was holding her bag. She stopped in the doorway. Her heart did something unpleasant. It fell, he said. He held the bag out, off the chair, the photograph. Face up or face down, she couldn't tell. His expression told her nothing. His expressions almost never did. She crossed the room and took the bag. Their hands were close for a moment, close enough that she could see the old scar along his knuckles, the one she'd never asked about. "Thank you," she said. She sat down. She turned on her monitor. She felt him still standing there. Senna. She should have told him right then. She knows that now. She should have pulled out the photograph and put it on the desk between them like a ledger entry, clean and factual, and let him deal with it the way he dealt with everything. Efficiently, without sentiment, without asking more than she wanted to give. She didn't. "The Moreau documentation came through," she said instead. "I'll have the summary ready by 10. A pause. Long enough that she almost looked up. "All right," he said. He went into his office. She listened to the door close. She spent the next 3 hours working. She did not think about the photograph. She did not think about the number she'd almost called. She did not think about what Lynette Haverstock's name felt like, sitting in the back of her mind like a paper cut. At noon, someone threw a brick through the lobby window. Nobody was hurt. The lobby had been empty. She'd stepped into the kitchen for 2 minutes, and the security guard had been around the corner, which later struck her as precisely calibrated. The brick had a note wrapped around it with a rubber band, 4 words in block letters, which she read before the security team arrived and collected it. She didn't tell anyone what it said. She sat at her desk for the rest of the afternoon and thought about exits. Not from the building, from the situation, from this particular shape of her life which she'd built so carefully, account by account, entry by entry over 2 years, and which was now demonstrably not as private as she'd required it to be. Corvin came out of his office at 5:15 and stood in her doorway. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He looked at her. She looked at him. She pulled the photograph out of her bag and set it on the desk facing him. He crossed the room in 5 steps. He looked at the photograph for a long time without touching it. She watched his jaw. She watched the particular stillness that came over him, the kind that was not calm but was made of the same material as calm. "When did you get this?" he said. 4 days ago. She watched him process that. "And the window," he said. "I think so, yes." He picked up the photograph. He turned it over and read the back and set it down again. "They think I confide in you," he said. "They think more than that," she said. "They think I'm already compromised. that there's already something to hold over me. Are they right? She looked at him. No, he looked at her for a long moment with that attention that cost something to be under. The debts, he said. She'd known it was coming. Yes, tell me, she told him. Not all of it. There were parts of the 6 years before she'd come to Toronto that she'd never told anyone, and she wasn't going to start now. But she told him enough. The amount, the people, the nature of the original obligation, which had never been hers to begin with, which she'd inherited the way you inherited most things that destroyed you. Through someone else's choices and your own refusal to leave them to their consequences. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. He asked them the way he asked everything, quietly, with the patience of a man who understood that some numbers took time to add up. When she was done, the office was very quiet. "Why didn't you tell me 4 days ago?" he said. She thought about the honest answer. She gave it to him. "Because I didn't want you to think you'd hired a liability," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not much. "A fraction of something. I hired you," he said slowly, "because you walked into an interview and told my operations director you'd found an error in my Gibraltar filing and that I'd want to hear the rest. I've worked with a great many people in my life, Senna. I can count the ones I'd describe as not a liability on one hand." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the photograph on the desk between them. "I should have told you immediately," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You should have." He picked up his phone. He made 2 calls that she didn't fully understand, using names she recognized and some she didn't, in the particular language of logistics that she'd learned to pass over 2 years without ever being asked to. When he hung up, he looked at her. "The debts," he said. "All of them. What's the number?" She told him. He nodded once, the way he nodded when she told him the results of an audit. "Consider it handled," he said. "I can't let you. It's not a gift," he said. "Put it on the books as an advance. You'll pay it back. I know you will, because you're the only person I've employed in 15 years who would insist on it." She looked at him for a long moment. "And the people who sent the photograph," she said, "also being handled." She nodded. She should have felt relieved. She felt something more complicated than that. The particular vertigo of having something you'd been carrying alone for years suddenly lifted without warning. The way your body didn't quite believe it for a while. The way your hands still tensed, reaching for a weight that wasn't there. "Lynette Haverstock," she said. "It came out anyway." He looked at her very carefully. "That's over," he said. She should have asked when. She should have asked why. She did neither. "I see," she said. "Do you?" The office was very quiet. The city hummed outside 12 floors down, all that ordinary motion continuing regardless. "I've been very careful," she said. "For 2 years. Very deliberate." "I know," he said. It was the professional thing to do. "Yes, I'm not sure," she said slowly, "that I'm going to be able to keep doing that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked at her. The photograph sat on the desk between them, face up, documenting a night when he'd driven her to a clinic and sat in the corner of the room with his coat still on, and she hadn't asked why, and he hadn't explained. "The car's downstairs," he said. "I assumed. I'll drive tonight." She looked at him. "You don't have to, Senna." His voice, the way it was sometimes, low and even and leaving no real room. "Let me drive you home." She picked up her coat. She picked up her bag. She looked at the desk once more, at 2 years of careful distance, documented neatly in the space between her chair and his office door. "All right," she said. She turned off her monitor. She walked to the door, and he was already there, holding it open, and she stepped through, and neither of them said another word until they were in the elevator. And then he said her name once, quietly, the way he almost never did, and she didn't answer, because she didn't need to, because some things don't require a response. They just require you to stand still and let them be true. The elevator doors opened. They walked out into the lobby, past the boarded-up window, into the cold Toronto night, and Senna Darke thought, "I am going to have to rebuild my entire accounting of this situation from the ground up." She didn't mind, for the first time in a very long time, where the numbers might land.